Hello everybody. Today we're doing something slightly different. We're talking about a movie. It's called Enemy at the Gates and it is set in the Battle of Stalingrad. It follows the story of Vassili Zaizev, who is a very skilled sniper based on the real person of the same name. It's a 2001 war movie and it has some major mistakes and sometimes even actual Nazi propaganda in it. I mentioned it in my last video as an example of modern day anti-USSR propaganda, and in this video I will basically be expanding on that criticism and showing more of the movie, which should give me a great excuse to talk about the USSR some more. The movie starts with a voiceover explaining that the Battle of Stalingrad is very important, saying that the fate of the world is being decided. Characters make this point many times as well, playing up Stalingrad as this ultimate battle. Khrushchev, who is in the movie, says that the entire country will collapse if Stalingrad falls. This is of course wrong. It's true that the fighting around the city was among the most fierce of the entire war because both sides were set on honoring the city, but to pretend that losing one city would destroy the whole country is ridiculous. The Soviets were prepared to fight to the last man, Stalingrad being defended or not. Matter of fact, the Soviets had already moved out all of Stalingrad's industry before the Germans arrived. This was to allow them to fight on even if they lost the city. They did this all over Russia. Even in Moscow they evacuated industry towards the Urals. I understand that this movie is dramatizing its setting to seem more exciting, but it needs to be understood that the USSR was not about to surrender. They planned for losing Leningrad, Stalingrad and Moscow, the same way they planned for losing Minsk and Kiev. After explaining what Stalingrad was, the movie begins in a train, rather a cattle cart, filled to the brim with young men wearing Red Army caps, and civilians. They stop for a second to throw out the civilians and add more people who are supposed to be soldiers, despite not even wearing the uniform beyond the side caps. Then the officers fucking lock the train carts for some reason, and one scene later they arrive in Stalingrad, about a month after the start of the battle. The soldiers are thrown out of the carts and immediately sent to boats. They're herded like cattle, and there seems to be no organization at all. There are no commanders, no units meeting up, nothing. They're just put on boats while a guy with a megaphone announces that Stalin ordered no step back. I will return to this. When they're all on the boats on their way to the side of the Volga where the battle is, you can see that many of them aren't wearing their uniforms, and looking closer they don't even have helmets, or their field packs, or rifles. They're on their way into battle without anything to fight the battle with, all while the commander is yelling about how brave they are. We get some tension when German airplanes strafe their boats and kill a lot of them, and then some jump off the boats and begin swimming, and the higher-ups immediately shoot those people in the back. I will also return to this later. When they arrive on the other docks, there are lots of people bunched up without cover. Luckily the Germans don't get the idea to drop one single bomb there, because that would be devastating. As before, everything is hectic and there's chaos like you've never seen. And the still unarmed soldiers are herded to the front line. On their way there, they are given guns. Sometimes. Only every second one actually gets a rifle.
One out of two gets a rifle, one without follows him. When the one with the rifle gets killed, the one who is following picks up the rifle and shoots.
The other half only gets a clip of bullets and they're sent to charge the enemy. Props to this guy who ran into battle only armed with a flag and a pistol. Naturally, a mass charge without tactics or support just ends in all of them being shot. So one guy yells to retreat and everyone listens. But when they turn back, the evil higher-ups, who apparently didn't take part in the attack, shoot them with machine guns for retreating, yelling no step back at them. After the battle, when almost everyone is dead, we hear German propaganda on loudspeakers saying that the Germans are not the enemies of the Soviet soldiers and that Stalin is the real enemy for sending them into battle without training or arms. And I think the movie's trying to make this out as correct. The Germans are right in this scene. They blame the officers for shooting their own soldiers. So, intentional or not, The movie is making the Nazis look like the good guys, compared to the Soviets at least. Then our hero survives the battle and meets a commissar named Danilov, shoots a few Germans and returns to his lines. And that was the opening minutes, and definitely the worst part of the movie. So let's look at it again and I point out all of the weird things. First of all, why the dramatic opening with the soldiers in the carts and being driven to the attack? What's this based on? Well, nothing. The Red Army did train and equip its recruits. They would at the very least have helmets and uniforms with them. And the Soviets didn't herd their soldiers into battle like cattle. They were well organized with commanders that knew their soldiers well. They had staging areas. They would not just run. They would be well organized and briefed before getting to their frontline sector. So if nothing about it is historical, why does this movie start off like that? My personal guess is that they tried to copy Saving Private Ryan. It's a movie that came out a few years before Enemy at the Gates, and it starts off with soldiers being sent on an amphibious invasion and almost all being killed, and it's very chaotic and action-packed. And of course, this is D-Day. I think the director tried to copy the starting action scene and really bent reality to get lots of fighting and dying early, and then only gave every second one guns for good measure. As mentioned, the Soviet soldiers were well equipped and trained. Matter of fact, they trained for 12 hours a day for a month before their first battle, and they learned how to use their entrenchment tool, aka a shovel, to kill people in case they lose their gun. Same for the bayonet that came with every gun. They would also be well trained in shooting and gun maintenance. Matter of fact, during training every soldier received their own gun, which they would go to battle with. The fact that nobody on the train has any weapons, supplies or even uniforms implies that they had no training at all and that the USSR just took random 20-year-old men, put them on trains and sent them to their deaths. It's even implied that they were not volunteers, which of course historically happened, but the main character was a volunteer historically. So what's up with that? But I think the movie actually intends for all of these soldiers to be untrained, conscripted, and sent into battle without a chance. Because in the scene after the battle, we see that a commissar doesn't know how to reload a gun. So maybe nobody in this alternative reality Soviet Union received any training. The movie is making it seem like the Soviets were untrained Untermenschen, kind of like the Nazi propaganda said. This is of course not reality. As I said, the soldiers were given their weapons while in training, so the whole thing about only every second one getting a gun is complete bullshit. They even went into battle while having lots of bullets with them. But that begs the question, why does the movie show it like this? Well, probably because of reported supply issues. You see, while all soldiers went into Stalingrad armed, at some point they ran out of ammunition, and the Red Army had difficulty supplying everyone with enough ammo over the river. They had plenty of guns, but not ammunition. I think the director heard about shortages and decided that this means the Soviets sent people without guns into German machine gun fire in huge waves. Which, by the way, if they actually had no guns, they would still have shovels and bayonets to give to the ones without guns. So they at least have some close quarters defense. But in this movie, bayonets and shovels don't seem to exist because we never see a single one. Much like we never see a soldier wearing a field pack. This whole thing about people just running onto a modern battlefield, trying to run it to the enemy trenches with some goal, is completely wrong as well. That would just lead to all of them being shot. Matter of fact, it was World War I, many years before, that completely ended the idea of just charging the enemy. Modern machine guns are too powerful. Instead, militaries, even the Soviet ones, developed new tactics like using machine gun fire to keep the enemy's heads down while another squad flanks them, or using tanks, artillery, aircraft, instead of just soldiers. It is true that the Soviet Union had worse battle tactics than the Germans during this stage of the war, but they were not so naive to let their own soldiers die en masse against a machine gun. To the credit of the movie, it is accurate that the Soviets had little artillery and aircraft in Stalingrad, but the soldiers would have used other tactics to advance, like smoke grenade to hide themselves while getting an advantageous position, or using snipers, which is what the movie is about. Human wave tactics were never used, like shown in the movie, by nobody in the entire war. Which brings me to the scene of the NKVD officers shooting at the soldiers that gave up on the attack and ran back. No, just no. This never happened. If they had a machine gun, they used it for defense against the enemy, not their own soldiers. To drive the point home, a commander still yells, "No, step back!" The same thing he yelled when he shot the people in the water in the previous scene. The implication being that the average soldier was not allowed to stop an attack at any point. And if they did it, they would be immediately shot by the cowardly commanders who hide in the backline. This is probably based on Stalin's Order 227, also known as the No Step Back Directive. This order said that officers who retreat without permission should be punished. There is not a word about common soldiers returning to their lines after a failed attack, though. There are parts that punish soldiers who desert, but that's a different thing from returning to your lines. The reason for the order was that lots of local commanders would retreat without permission because they didn't feel like they could stop the Germans. These local commanders were the ones that should take no step back. And if they were found to have abandoned their post, the same thing would happen that would happen to deserting soldiers. They would be court-martialed and sent to penal battalions. Those were battalions that were sent to the hardest parts of the front line, like minefields and such. This was so they could redeem themselves, at least according to the order. Of course, depending on the level of the desertion, the court-martial may end in an execution. To get the number, in October of 42, a total of 16,000 soldiers and commanders were found deserting or disobeying orders, and of them about 300 were shot, with the rest being sent to penal battalion. That's 1 in 50 being executed. These executions were not done by the NKVD shooting people in their backs. Instead, the court-martials and executions were done publicly, so all soldiers saw what happens to deserters. This is of course awful, because executions are barely ever a good thing. But interestingly, the Germans and Americans did the same thing. Deserters could get the death penalty, and it was carried out in public as an example of what not to do. So the other soldiers would know. So that's a bad thing which everyone in the war did. That was just the opening minutes of the movie. But lucky us, from then on, the plot follows the sniper, so it's less history-based and more just writing and made-up plot. Which, to be fair, is alright. That's within the creative license, I'd say. Talking about being creative, I spent 30 hours on this video and YouTube immediately demonetized it for copyright. So why not donate me 1 or 2 money so this work week was worthwhile? We return to a scene of a famous general entering the city. It's Khrushchev. The man who would be the general secretary after Stalin. No, Milenkov does not count. It's actually historically accurate that he was in the battle. But personally, I would have preferred to see Zhukov, who was also there and later took Berlin. Honestly, I just don't think of Khrushchev as a great general. What is less accurate is what happens after he arrives. Civilians want to evacuate to the safe side of the Volga, but the soldiers say that by order of Comrade Stalin, no civilian can leave the city, and then they shoot the civilians. Which is weird, because historically the USSR evacuated all citizens from Stalingrad before the Germans even showed up. It seems the movie wants to portray the Soviets as monsters for shooting civilians who are fleeing. Just sad that this is completely made up and never happened. Then Khrushchev makes a Soviet general shoot himself, which is interesting because that's not something that ever happened in the Red Army. They would have show trials and possibly execute someone, but they want pressure generals to shoot themselves. But of course, historically there were people who made generals shoot themselves when they made mistakes. The Nazis. Yet again, the movie is taking things which the Nazis did and trying to pretend the Soviets did that as well. Then Khrushchev holds a speech in front of the political commissars, talking about how important this city is and all, and he asks the commissars what to do to win. And they all suggest randomly executing people for not winning. But then our hero Danilov suggests to write about heroic soldiers instead of killing people. So they do that and they make Vassili a war hero for being such a great sniper. Just to clarify, the Soviets had heroes before that. There was a literal medal called Hero of the Soviet Union since the early 30s. And likewise, the Soviets used propaganda since the Civil War. This idea that propaganda heroes were a new concept in 1942 is ridiculous. Then we get long compilations of Vassili killing people, which is historically accurate because he did rank up over 200 kills. Eventually the Germans bring in their best sniper, Major König, who is tasked with killing Vassili. The German commander notes that they will be home by Christmas, which is a World War I saying, but whatever. Giant Stalin head. Just think about how huge that statue must have been. For comparison, here's the largest Stalin statue that exists. Then Vassili is invited to the Soviet headquarters in Stalingrad to get his picture taken with Khrushchev, and it looks like a fucking villa, with plenty of food and people and everything is clean and nice, and also a giant Stalin painting. Of course, being in the middle of a war zone, the actual real-life headquarters was in a bombed-out house. Why does it look like a palace in the movie? I think it's supposed to showcase party corruption. As in, all high-ups hide in their palaces and the poor downtrodden soldiers need to sleep in the mud and fight. Of course, the whole thing about parties becoming corrupt and increasing their individual wealth at the cost of the people is more a thing that happened in the 80s and 90s, before the collapse, not during the World War, so that's kinda unrealistic in this movie. Then we get many long scenes of Vassili barely outsmarting Major König, and a weird trend emerges. Vassili keeps getting introduced to new people who would snipe with him, and they all die on their first mission. So every 10 minutes there's a new character who immediately dies, and there seems to be no good reason. He goes through 6 allies, and none of these people are based on real characters. My best guess is that the director wanted to generate tension by showing how strong Major König is, in the same way that Star Trek generates tension by killing the red shirts. One of these was trained by the bad guy, by König, and then tells the story of how when he came back from training in Germany, the NKVD knocked out all of his teeth for being in Germany, even though Stalin ordered him to get trained there. This is sort of partly based in reality. Soviet specialists were trained in Germany before the war, but they were not punished for returning. They were sent there to train. And also there is no record of the NKVD ever knocking out people's teeth as punishments. They did lots of reprehensible things, don't get me wrong, but not that specific one. So yet another story made up to make the USSR seem worse, I guess. Then we hear a story of Germans rounding up Jewish people in Stalingrad and killing them, which is the first time the Germans are said to have something bad. It's not shown, we just hear about it. If only Stalin had evacuated the city, these people would not have had to die. Except this is all made up and civilians were all evacuated. Nobody who had lived in Stalingrad died as part of the Holocaust. Then we get more scenes of Vassili and König trying to outsmart each other. Then there is a triangle romance and a straight sex scene. And if you watch out for it, you notice how many movements have unnecessary straight sex. This is a movie about a sniper in Stalingrad and they fucking fuck. What the fuck? Then Vassili fakes his death to lure out Major König. König is recalled back to the Reich. There we see Germans interacting again and a trend is showing. That's that the Germans are calm and respectful with each other. König is even nice to the little Russian kid that cleans his boots. Meanwhile, the Soviets are shown to be the worst, most emotional people ever. Just compare these two scenes.
They have artillery, aircraft, tanks. And me, what did I have?
The sacred duty to resist.
I do not believe.
There's a plane bound for Berlin tomorrow evening. You will be on it.
It effectively looks like the Germans are actually the civilized super people and the Russians are actually the screeching Untermensch. I don't know if this was intentional, but holy shit, what the fuck? Eventually, the girl the love triangle was based on gets injured, which makes the commissar so sad that he talks about how socialism is bad because there will always be people who are rich in love, which definitely means that economic prosperity and equality are not worth pursuing. Eventually, the commissar steps out in the open to get shot to make Meja König give away his position so Vassili can kill him. And then it's February 3rd and the Russians celebrate the unconditional surrender of the German army in Stalingrad. And then the movie ends. And I could leave it at that, but I would like to tell you about the actual Vassili Zaizev before we're done. He was part of the navy in Vladivostok when the war broke out, and he requested to be sent to the west. He never had the lowest rank because his navy rank translated to an army rank. He was a skilled sharpshooter and immediately assigned to the sniper division. He then spent the better part of the Battle of Stalingrad shooting enemies and training new snipers. There was no Major König. The Germans tried to kill him, but never by counter-deploying snipers. Eventually, after 200 kills, he was injured by a German mortar attack, which is how the Germans dealt with snipers. The attack left him blind on both eyes, so he was not even around for the liberation of Stalingrad. Luckily, a doctor saved his vision, and Vassili was given the Order of the Hero of the Soviet Union. When he was done recovering, he followed the front line westwards, fighting against fascism. He settled down in Kiev in Ukraine and lived there until 1991 when he died. So in conclusion, the movie makes up the entire story, which is fair enough, but what's not fair enough is that fact that it literally portrays Soviets worse than the Nazis by making up shit from thin air. Frankly, it seems like a lazy piece of propaganda. So yeah, I hope you learned something from this video. Thanks to everyone who donates. Because of copyright I can't monetize this video. So thank you for making me able to pay my health insurance in spite of YouTube ignoring fair use laws. If you want to see more, subscribing is a good idea. And if you have friends who may be interested in it, why not share this video with them? Other than that, I wish you a wonderful week. Thank you for watching, and special thanks to Theon Hartley, Potato God 777, Alan Vo, Darius de Berg, Eric Betts, Harris Hawk, Marcus Aurelio, V, Xander Corvus, Attila Nemetz, Caressa, Comrade Falcon, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Roselli, DSM5 is better than ICD-10, Emily Marigold Klassen, Evie Wren, Hordina, Marcus Arolia for a second time somehow, Josh C, Klaus Strupp, Liam S, Lilith Craft, Mamuka Ciliari, Marxism Tonight, Nana Epema, Poet, Raven DeVille, Red Shock Trooper, Sean Murphy, Stemmaster Chef, Taylor CH, Theodore, Gillian, Junior, and Trey.